Friends of Islam, this time the Islamic faith is back before you to share Islamic information. I hope it inspires your activities today, and don't forget to click the subscribe button and activate the bell button notifications so you don't miss the latest news from the Islamic Faith channel. In a small town surrounded by green hills, there lived a boy named Ahmad. He was only 12 years old, but his intelligence surpassed that of children his age. Ahmad was the son of a fruit seller in the market. His days were spent in a small town surrounded by green hills, helping his father carry fruit crates and serving customers. However, behind his simple life, Ahmad had an extraordinary spirit of learning. Every morning before sunrise, Ahmad would run to a small mosque on the edge of the village to study the Qur'an with Imam Zed Ahmad. Not only did he memorize verses, Ahmad also always asked about their meanings. His questions often made Imam Z smile in surprise. "You are a special child," said Imam Zed one morning. "Your understanding of religion is deeper than you realize. Keep studying, because knowledge will be the light that guides your path." Ahmad just smiled shyly. He did not feel special. For him, studying was a form of worship, a way to get closer to Allah. However, in that small town, not everyone agreed with Ahmad's beliefs. At the edge of town, there was a church led by Reverend William, a famous pastor from the big city. Reverend William was known for his fiery sermons that could shake the congregation, but often accompanied by sharp criticism of other religions. News of Reverend William's arrival in the small town spread like wildfire. People flocked to the church to hear his sermons. However, there were whispers among the Muslims that his visit was not only to preach, but also to humiliate Islam and its followers. "He will hold a big lecture this week," said a trader in the market to Ahmad's father. "They say he likes to challenge Muslims to prove the truth of their faith. We must be careful," said the trader. Ahmad's father nodded. "Let him speak as he pleases. The truth is not up for debate. Ahmad, help your father arrange these apples." Ahmad listened to the conversation attentively. In his heart, curiosity grew mixed with a desire to know what would happen. He never thought that soon his life would be connected with the famous preacher in an unexpected way. The night before Pastor William's sermon, Ahmad sat in the mosque courtyard after the Isha prayer. He looked up at the starry sky and pondered. "Oh Allah," he whispered, "if I am given the opportunity, allow me to defend your truth, even though I am only a child." Ahmad's prayer soared high into the sky, marking the beginning of a new chapter in his life. A great destiny awaited him, and the small town would witness the courage of a simple boy who would amaze everyone. The awaited day arrived. The large church in the city center was filled with worshipers. Many of them came not only to hear Pastor William's sermon, but also because they were curious about the news that the preacher would prove that Islam was a false religion. Outside the church, the atmosphere became lively. The chatter among the congregation became more enthusiastic. Meanwhile, in another corner, a group of Muslims gathered, feeling pressured, but still curious about what was about to happen. Among them stood Ahmad, who was silent, observing the scene with sharp eyes and a mind full of questions. Inside the church, Pastor William stood at the pulpit, wearing a long robe that gave him an air of authority. His voice was loud and confident. "Brothers and sisters," he said, "today we are not only talking about faith, but also about the truth, and the truth must be told." The congregation cheered, giving Pastor William their full support. William continued, "If there are any of you who are Muslims and believe that your religion is the right path, I challenge you to come forward. Let's see who has the answer to my question." The challenge silenced the entire room. The congregation began to glance at each other, waiting to see if anyone was brave enough to accept the challenge. But not a single Muslim was moved. Some of those who had come only to listen lowered their heads, feeling helpless in the face of the famous preacher's sharp rhetoric. Outside the church, the atmosphere was tense. Ahmad heard the loud noise and his curiosity grew stronger. He entered the church even though several Muslims tried to stop him. "Ahmad, this is none of your business," whispered one of them. But Ahmad did not listen. He felt that this was his chance to do something great. With steady steps, the boy walked forward, standing in the middle of the large room filled with worshipers. All eyes were on him. Pastor William looked at Ahmad with a surprised expression, then smiled disdainfully. "A little boy," he thought. "Is this the best defender the Muslims have in this city?" Ahmad was not deterred. In a calm but clear voice, he replied, "Pastor, I may be a child, but I believe that truth is not determined by age. You want to ask questions, and I will try to answer with what I know." The room became quieter. The congregation began to be impressed with the boy and his courage. Although many still thought he would not be able to stand up to a great priest like Pastor William, a sense of admiration began to grow among them. "Very good," said Pastor William with a sneer. "Let's begin. If your God is as you say, why does he need angels and prophets to convey his will? Doesn't this show weakness?" Ahmad closed his eyes for a moment, praying silently, asking for strength and wisdom. Then with full confidence, he replied, "Pastor, let me ask you a question in return. Do you have a right hand and a left hand?" The question confused the pastor a little, but he replied, "Of course." Ahmad continued, "Why do you use your right hand to write and your left hand to hold the book? Are you not strong enough to do everything with just one hand?" The room fell silent. The congregation exchanged glances, trying to understand the boy's answer. Pastor William's face stiffened, but before he could say anything, Ahmad continued, "The law is almighty, but he created angels and prophets not because of their weakness, but to show us the best way to live. Just as you use both your hands for different purposes, Allah uses his creatures to convey his messages in the best way for humanity." Some of the congregation began to whisper. They did not expect the boy to give such a simple yet reasonable answer. Pastor William tried to hide his surprise. "Okay," he said, "then let me ask you something more difficult. If your God exists, why can't we see him?" Ahmad smiled. He knew this was a question often asked by many who doubted the existence of God. Calmly, he replied, "Pastor, can you see your own thoughts? Can you see love or compassion? Just because something cannot be seen does not mean it does not exist. We see God through all of his creation. If Islam is the true religion, why are there so many poor and oppressed Muslims in the world?" The answer left some of the congregation stunned. Some of them nodded slowly, as if they had realized something they had never thought about before. Pastor William began to lose his patience. In a louder tone, he said, "Then answer this." Ahmad remained calm, even though he knew the question was meant to attack his emotions. He raised his head and said, "Pastor, the exam is not given to a student who has failed before, but to a student who wants to pass. I will testify to his people, not because he does not care, but because he wants to elevate them. Hardship is a sign of his love, not the weakness of his people." Ahmad's words echoed through the church. The congregation began to see this little boy not as an ordinary child, but as someone who brought the truth. Pastor William was no longer smiling. There was a doubt on his face that had never been seen before. Unbeknownst to Ahmad, something extraordinary was happening, not only to the congregation, but even to Pastor William himself. The church that had once been filled with pride was now silent, filled with reflection. A new chapter had begun, and Ahmad had shown that courage and faith could move the hearts of anyone, even those who had initially opposed him. The church hall was silent. The congregation that had once cheered for Reverend William was now silent. They stared at Ahmad with curious eyes, as if the little boy held the key to unlocking a door of understanding that had been tightly closed for so long. Meanwhile, Reverend William, usually full of confidence, seemed restless. He paced the pulpit, trying to find a way to continue the debate without losing his authority. Every word that came out of Ahmad's mouth seemed to break down the walls of rhetoric that Reverend William had built over the years. In a softer tone, but still trying to maintain his authority, Reverend William said, "Okay, young man, your answer is quite clever. But let me ask you one last question. If your God is just, why does he allow suffering? Why is there war, famine, and death, even among Muslims?" Ahmad was silent for a moment. He closed his eyes, remembering the lessons that Imam Zed had once taught him. With full confidence, he opened his eyes and said, "Pastor, let me ask you. If you see a teacher giving a difficult test to his students, does that mean the teacher doesn't care about them?" Pastor William frowned. "Of course not. Teachers give tests to measure the students' abilities." Ahmad nodded. "So that's also the case with Allah. Suffering is not a sign that Allah is unfair, but a form of test to measure the faith and patience of his servants. Allah gives us the mind, strength, and heart to overcome difficulties. Through these trials, He elevates our status, like a teacher preparing his students to advance to a higher level. The answer left many in the congregation stunned. Some even shed tears. An elderly woman in the back row whispered, "This child is wise beyond his years. His words are very touching." Pastor William seemed at a loss for words. He tried to think of a counter-argument, but every thought that came to his mind felt weak compared to the clarity and sincerity of Ahmad's answer. Suddenly, a man from the front row, a devout church member known for his strong faith, stood up and said, "Pastor William, with all due respect, I would like to ask this boy." "Young man, where did you get all this knowledge?" "Pastor William, with all due respect, I would like to ask this boy." "Young man, where did you get all this knowledge? How could a boy your age have such deep understanding?" Ahmad smiled humbly and replied, "All of this comes from the Qur'an, the word of Allah revealed through the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. I only read, study, and try to understand it. The Qur'an is the light that guides me, and I am sure that light can also guide anyone who sees it with a sincere heart." Ahmad's answer made many people aware. A drastic change occurred in the atmosphere of the church. The congregation, who had initially come to support Pastor William, began to ask Ahmad about Islam, the Qur'an, and the beliefs that they had always considered wrong. Ahmad answered each question with patience and sincerity. There was no arrogance or condescension, only the intention to share the truth. His words were simple yet meaningful, touching the hearts of many in the room. In the midst of the increasingly tense atmosphere, Pastor William suddenly spoke in a low voice, almost a whisper. "Young man, I have been preaching for over 20 years. I have spent my life believing that my religion is the right way. But today, you have made me question everything." The church room became even quieter than before. All eyes were on Pastor William, who now looked very different from the dignified figure who had stood at the pulpit moments before. He looked like a man struggling with his own heart. "If what you say is true," Pastor William continued, "then perhaps I have overlooked something very important in my life." Ahmad looked at Pastor William with compassionate eyes and said, "The truth is always there, Pastor. Sometimes we just need to open our hearts to see it. If we truly seek it, I believe God will guide us to the right path." Suddenly, a man from the front row, a devout church member known for his strong faith, stood up and said, "Pastor William, with all due respect, I would like to ask this boy, 'Young man, where did you get all this knowledge?' Pastor William, with all due respect, I would like to ask this boy, 'Young man, where did you get all this knowledge? How could a boy your age have such deep understanding?" Ahmad smiled humbly and replied, "All of this comes from..." Ahmad heard this, his eyes filled with tears. With a trembling voice, he replied, "I am only a little young pastor, but I will try my best to help you." Imam Zed, who was sitting next to Ahmad, said, "Allah has given guidance to those who sincerely seek it. It will help you understand Islam, William. This is not an easy journey, but the door is always open to those who want to get closer to Allah." The following days were a meaningful journey for Pastor William. He studied the Qur'an, engaged in long discussions with Imam Zed, and reflected on many things that he had previously ignored. The deeper he studied Islam, the more he felt a peace that he had never felt before. Not only that, the congregation that had previously supported Pastor William also began to show great interest in Islam. They approached Ahmad and Imam Zed to ask about the religion that they had only heard from a negative perspective. Ahmad patiently answered their questions, sometimes using simple analogies that made complex concepts easy to understand. Then one day in a church full of people, Pastor William stood before them. But this time, it was not to preach emotionally. His voice sounded different. "My brothers and sisters," he said, "for years I have led you on the path that I thought was right. However, a little child has opened my eyes to a greater truth. After studying Islam, I have discovered a part that I never knew before." The entire congregation was shocked. Some even cried, but no one shouted or protested. Pastor William continued, I have decided to embrace Islam, not because I want to leave you, but because I want you to see the truth that I have discovered. If you want to know more, let's study together." The incident was a major turning point for the church. Many members of the congregation began to learn about Islam, and most of them eventually followed Pastor William's example and embraced Islam. Ahmad, who watched all this from the corner of the room, felt humbled. He never imagined that his courage in responding to the challenge that day would bring about such a big change. Imam Zed patted him on the shoulder and said, "Ahmad, you have become an instrument of Allah to spread the truth. Remember, it's not about you, it's about God, about God's guidance working through your heart." Ahmad nodded, his eyes wet with tears of joy. His years of joy had come. He realized that his courage and intelligence were only a small part of God's grand plan. The church eventually became a center of Islamic studies, where people from all walks of life came to learn about the religion that had touched their hearts. The small town witnessed how the light of truth could spread through a child with a faith as big as a mountain, and Ahmad, a humble market boy, became an inspiration to many. He proved that truth knows no boundaries, status, age, or physical strength. Only a sincere heart and strong faith can bring about great change in a person's life. This story serves as a lasting reminder that God chooses whomever He wills to bring the light of truth. Ahmad is proof that even a child can be the source of great change as long as he has faith in Him.